I'm Michelle Kidwell-Gilbert. I'm chair of the Archaeology Committee. For those in the audience who are unfamiliar with the Arts Club, founded in 1898, we're a 501c3 nonprofit based in Gramercy Park with a mission to stimulate, foster, and promote interest in the arts. Annually, the club offers approximately 150 free programs to the public, including exhibitions, and you have one up on the halls, and you can see downstairs there's an exhibition that my co-chair, Lynn Mayacole, and Brian are part of. So enjoy those exhibitions and see them while you're at the club tonight. There are lectures, readings, theatrical, and musical performances. For more information about the National Arts Club, visit us on nacnyc.org or find us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. On behalf of President Dr. Tara Cortez, the Board of Governors, and the Archaeology Committee, I am particularly delighted that Peter Lacovara, Sue D'Auria, and Sue Lezon, seated here, will relate their personal recollections of studying with or working under the truly great late Professor Lanny David Bell in a program entitled Lanny Bell, An Egyptological Life. A scholar's scholar. Not only did he excavate at various locations throughout Egypt and educate a generation of superlative Egyptologists, but also the unique Lanny Bell was chosen to brief President Jimmy Carter regarding Egyptian culture and history. Being that our event is presented in collaboration with the American Research Center in Egypt's national headquarters and New York Society, I gratefully request that RC's board, staff, and members kindly stand. May I have you stand? I'm standing also because I'm a member of RC New York's chapter. Now I want to say, those of you here, anyone who attended Lanny's lectures at the National Arts Club. Now, a number of you have attended Lanny's 2 lectures. Don't be shy. You want Cindy? I know you did. Arlene, you can stand also, and others in the audience. Thank you, Cindy. Others in the audience, all Lanny's lectures with RC. Those of you who did, stand. Or accompanied Lanny when he traveled to Egypt. Now, we have a whole group, and we have the organizer of those trips. Okay? And let me mention, as a side, nothing to do with Lanny, I have spoken in the past of going on the RC's King Tut trip. This was the organizer of it as well. Okay? Wonderful, wonderful programs. Okay. Now, I think a very goodly portion of our audience has stood, and for a wonderful reason, you're all here. Lanny's first club lecture in April of 2009 focused on mummies and Osiris's journeys. Lanny spoke brilliantly as anticipated. At the beginning of the evening, His Excellency Ambassador Mohammed Fatih Idris from the Arab Republic of Egypt addressed the audience in Lanny's honor. During the dinner which followed, the 2 men conversed in Arabic, which pleased them both enormously. And now you have something up, and you may be wondering what that is. Well, Lanny subsequently provided needed counsel to me a few months later, in advance of the National Arts Club presenting its gold medal to Archaeology magazine on October 14th, 2009. I wanted some special music played during the reception, which might have been enjoyed by archaeologists in Egypt. Lanny graciously instructed me to write, using his name, to Ray Johnson, director of Chicago House, the Oriental Institute's headquarters in Luxor, a major center of Egyptological studies for Egyptians and foreign scholars alike. Ray assigned a student to go through the archives. Might that individual be present this evening? And that's a serious question. I guess not. She or he located a letter sent by the son of James Henry Bressard, the renowned Egyptologist who founded the Oriental Institute, listing records shipped for a New Year's Eve celebration. Now, how do I get the second page? You all know by now, technically challenged forever, and I need Devon's expert assistance. Thank you. Oh, good, and that'll help me for the third that I want to show. The club creatively draped a skeleton in a white sheet, with the music seemingly magically emanating out of the body itself. It was an extraordinary moment. And I remember when I got I got the list from Ray Johnson. And with a member of the committee, we went to Lincoln Center's Performing Arts Library to try to find copies of all the recordings. Much to my pleasure, they had them all. Now, Lanny's second club lecture. Offered on March 28th, 2012, focused on the mythology and iconography of divine kingship and queenship in ancient Egypt. Permit me to quote from the invitation's text which he provided. By the new kingdom, this fundamental tenet of ancient Egyptian religion exhibited a high degree of sophistication. A solar incarnation, Pharaoh manifested the sun's powers. Deceased, his divine spirit rejoined it, while his transfigured body was buried in a tomb where the sun's dramatic nightly rebirth was enacted. Kindly now join with the Archaeology Committee in welcoming our three eminent lecturers. Peter Lacovara treats Lanny's early life and career, especially at the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago. Lanny served as Peter's dissertation chief, assisting him with archaeological field work while in Luxor. He will be followed by Sue Lezon, who discusses Lanny's time at the University of Pennsylvania. And lastly, Sue Lezon talks about Lanny at, once again, the University of Chicago and Chicago House. All three have been involved with the publication of From the Field of Offerings, Studies in Memory of Lanny D. Bell, a volume honoring the great man's life and work. Now about Peter. Returning lecturer Peter Lacovara formerly served as senior curator of ancient Egyptian, Nubian, and Near Eastern art at the Michael C. Carlos Museum of Emory University, and directs the Ancient Egyptian Heritage and Archaeology Fund, which supports research and conservation on Egyptian history and culture. Additionally, he directs excavations and restorations at Deir el-Baras, for which he, along with the American University in Cairo, received a grant for rescue archaeology from RC. His publications include Studies on Daily Life and Urbanism in Ancient Egypt, Egyptian Mortuary Traditions, and Material Culture of Ancient Egypt and Nubia. Peter, please.
Thanks, Michelle. I'll stick this in here. Good. Can you hear me from that? Is that working? Up? Up? I have to hold it? Okay. Let's start here. So, Lanny Bell was born on April 30th, 1941. Oops. Okay. In the small town of Fort Dodge, Iowa, and to Margaret. This is with his mother Margaret, and there he is as a child, and child is the father of the man. That is a typical Lanny, very friendly, kind of, it's perfect. For those who knew Lanny, this is Lanny in a nutshell. And this is Lanny with his brother, Brian. And they were a very close family. And Lanny, to help put himself through school, got a job in a hog farm. There was not much to do in Fort Dodge. But he excelled in school, and he took Latin and was fascinated with ancient languages, and also saw Egyptian hieroglyphs and became obsessed with them, and decided to go study Egyptian hieroglyphs at the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago with John Wilson, and then went on to do graduate work at the University of Pennsylvania. And there he met Martha Rhodes Bell, a fellow student, and was adopted by her family. And this is her grandmother, who was taking care of Lanny while he was ill. And eventually after being approved by the family, he was able to marry Martha. And Martha was a scholar in her own right. She was a Bronze Age Greek scholar, very well regarded, a really brilliant scholar in her own right, and was a real partner to Lanny in excavation and working in Egypt. And she herself got her degree from Penn. Here's Lanny and Martha and Lanny's mother. And she also then went with Lanny to Egypt, to Chicago House, that Sue will tell you more about. But they really transformed Chicago House into a very welcoming place for everyone. And one of their traditions they set was to make Christmas cookies to give to all the foreign expeditions. But I was there once, and Martha told the kitchen staff to make cookies like they had before for the last party, but unfortunately the last party was Halloween, so they came out with all these bats and witches. So we had to turn the bats into holly and the witches into angels. But it's typical of how kind and generous they were to everybody. I was working in the desert, and Martha had to make her own peanut butter. In those days, they couldn't get it in Egypt, and they would fill me up with peanut butter as I went out into the tent. And also they looked after, this is the famous Seti with Martha at Abydos. And so they also looked out after her as well. And they were always so kind of generous and helpful to everyone. So they really transformed Chicago House, which was apparently before was a kind of cold and uninviting place. I remember Martha telling me she once asked Myrtle Nims how she got wine stains out of the tablecloth, and Myrtle Nims looked at her and said, "We never served wine." But anyway, you'll hear a lot more about Lanny from Sue and Sue.
Sue Lezon is an Egyptologist who worked for nearly 2 decades at the Department of Ancient Egyptian, Nubian, and Near Eastern Art at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, and was associate curator at the Huntington Museum of Art. She has edited several books, including Nubian Gold, Ancient Jewelry from the Sudan and Egypt, and Pharaohs of the Sun, Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and Tutankhamun, which she edited along with Rita Fried, who will be returning to the club next June.
Lanny did his graduate work at the University of Pennsylvania, and he also taught and worked on the university's excavations at Abydos. And he worked under David O'Connor, pictured here, and Yaroslav Cherny, who was a visiting professor at that time. And Lanny was my first professor of hieroglyphs when I was a beginning graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania. And he was a wonderful teacher. He was kind, he was patient, he was funny, he had a wonderful sense of humor, and he had a laugh that I can still hear after all these years in my head. In 1968, he instituted a field project to return to the site of Dra Abu el Naga, which was first excavated by Clarence Fisher for Penn in 1921 to 1923. And this is a plan. You can see drivable Naga number 1 on the top of the plan there. It's one of the longest occupied burial grounds of ancient Egypt. It was used almost continuously between the Middle Kingdom and the early Christian or Coptic period, a period of about 2,500 years. And its importance increased over time because it was located directly across the Nile from Karnak Temple, one of ancient Egypt's most important temples in the New Kingdom. And there were processional ways that led on the East Bank and the West Bank to Naga. His project lasted almost 10 years, and here you can see the village, and many of the tombs were located in between modern structures where people were actually still living. Fisher had cleared and planned 22 decorated tombs, mostly Ramesside, 19th dynasty, of high officials, and 3 of the 4 tombs of the Ramesside high priest of Amun in Luxor and 2 viceroys of Kush were in his concession and were all unpublished. The epigraphic record from Fisher's work was incomplete because the ceilings and walls were covered with centuries of soot and dirt that obscured the decoration and the texts. So the aims of the project, as Lanny said, were to verify the excavation records and complete the documentation, to organize and study the evidence, and to translate and comment on the text so that these tombs could be properly published. He was assistant investigator under Cherney and O'Connor, but he completed the copying and collating of texts in the tomb of Bekan Khans I, who was the high priest of Amun for 27 years near the end of the reign of Ramses II. Bekan Khans had an 80-year career that began when, as a youth, he served Seti I, the predecessor of Ramses II, as overseer of his training stable. And here you can see a plan of the tomb. It was a complex tomb with underground chambers, a burial chamber, and a platform with a pyramid at the top. And here's an artist's rendition of what it would have looked like. Well, Lanny wrote about those years in a series of articles in Expedition magazine, which was the magazine of the Museum of the University of Pennsylvania, and he had wonderful observations on life in the field. He said, because of some missing this was at the beginning of the expedition and had a bit of a rocky start. He says, because of some missing papers, my departure was delayed for over a week, every day of which friends in the museum bid me farewell, only to see me again the following morning. In the end, they seemed surprised that I actually left. But eventually all the papers were ready and I had a reservation. On the scheduled day of the flight out of Philadelphia, however, the airline called to advise me that weather conditions were unsatisfactory and that I should therefore take a train to New York to meet the flight. Of course, weather conditions were also unsettled at Kennedy. But after a wait of some 5 hours there, I finally boarded at about 1 o'clock in the morning on January 28th. He also arrived in Luxor with luggage of over 100 pounds of excavation supplies, which surprised the airline. I'm still amazed that the airline would call and tell him to take the train to New York to make the flight. It was difficult work. The tombs were of poor quality. As you can see here, there were large cracks and faults that had to be filled in. Decoration had fallen off the walls. They also had to clear debris from the tomb of Neb-Wenenef, who was high priest beginning in the year 1 of Ramses II. And he was an interesting person because he had a mortuary temple, one of the very few commoners known in the New Kingdom to do so. And because of the nature of that work, they had to hire as many as 37 workmen and boys to clear the tomb because it was so clogged with up to 6 feet of debris. They also made a lot of improvements. They put in electricity because trying to use mirrors to light the chambers from outside was impossible. That was like the traditional way of trying to light the interiors, was to have someone stand outside in the mirror with the mirror catching the sun to reflect it into the interior of the tomb, and have additional mirrors to try to train the light on the walls, which of course was very difficult. They had to shore up ceilings and rebuild columns in one chamber in the tomb of Neb-Wenenef. And to clean the walls in the tomb of Bekan Khans, he had to use a solvent that wasn't allowed to be brought on a plane. So he had to take a 12-hour trip from Cairo to Luxor with them. And they also increased the security of the tombs by renovating the existing modern doorways and installing new metal doors. Well, Lanny said about working in these tombs, nothing is quite so unnerving as to enter a tomb cautiously, taking care not to fall into a shaft and not to tread on any cobra which might be there, and suddenly see something scurrying across the low ceiling just ahead. The heart nearly stops until it is ascertained that this is merely a harmless lizard. Even a sparrow came regularly to one of the tombs to pick at the plaster, thereby destroying its decorated surface. It was thought best to attempt to discourage such behavior, particularly since having just heard the story, purported to be true, of a tomb whose decoration was entirely eaten by chickens searching for the lime used in its stuccoed walls. And he had a very specific technique. He said, "We have tried to combine the skills of epigraphers, conservators, archaeologists, photographers, artists, and architects to strip away the shrouds of dirt and soot obscuring these tombs, bind up the various wounds, and slowly unlock the mysteries they have successfully concealed for so long." And here you can see a view of a conservator working on the walls, and you can see very clearly the white areas that had been cleaned and the dark areas that still had to be cleaned. It was a lot of work. Well, according to their routine, the epigrapher first checked a collation sheet against the original 1920s version from Fisher's work, making note of errors, which you can see here. After a second epigrapher corrected the copy, together they returned to the wall to resolve any differences in their readings. The resulting version was then compared to any parallel text that they were able to find elsewhere. And a final check was made when the walls were cleaned and repaired. And here you can see Ray Slater, who was a graduate student at the time, teetering on top of the ladder to try to access one of the walls. They saved the cleaning for last to avoid any inadvertent damage that might occur during the cleaning. And here's a line drawing from the publication of one of the high priests dressed in his priestly garb, and one of the walls as it was finally cleaned. One of the tombs had been used as a Coptic Christian sanctuary, but luckily, instead of damaging the reliefs, the Copts had covered them over with a wash, which actually preserved the decoration underneath and could be removed. But it was a very labor-intensive process to remove that wash. The team found some small objects, mostly Ramesside and later, and even, amazingly, some fake objects, which you see here, and molds from a once thriving fakes industry that had been taking place inside the tomb of Nebuchadnezzar. But the work at the site did provide some significant artifacts for the University of Pennsylvania Museum, including statuary, pottery, funerary objects, and painted reliefs. The expedition stayed at the Habu Hotel in Medinet Habu, which I think is familiar to many Egyptologists. And Lanny said, toward the end of our stay there, the hotel became a depot for some of the props of a professional movie company on location for the filming of the story of the 1881 discovery of the Deir al-Bahri cache of royal mummies. Consequently, we were able to witness at close hand some of the commotion and excitement, so much a part of the production of a major picture. Well, this picture was The Night of Counting the Years, which has been said to be one of the greatest films of Egyptian cinema. And it was a story of the finding of this cache of mummies by a local family that was known for this kind of activity. And they started selling objects from the tomb, which became known on the art market and became known to local officials. So the two brothers were arrested, and the tomb was eventually taken over by the Antiquities Organization. But unfortunately, it was cleared very quickly, and so the proper documentation was never really done for the tomb. Well, Lanny taught Egyptian hieroglyphs, and he became assistant professor of Egyptology in 1976. And he completed his dissertation that year. It was entitled Interpreters and Egyptianized Nubians in Ancient Egyptian Foreign Policy, Aspects of the History of Egypt and Nubia. Here's an artist rendition of one of the forts that the Egyptians built at the Second Cataract to control traffic and trade in the area. And you can see Egyptian officials interacting with the local Nubians. one of his dissertation supervisors was George Hughes. And Hughes had served at the head of the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, and he was also the former field director at Chicago House, which is the headquarters in Luxor of the Epigraphic Survey. And he recommended Lanny for the position of director of Chicago House. And Lanny accepted and left the following year, and all of his graduate students were really sorry to see him go. And I had the opportunity to see Lanny a few times in Luxor after he took that position, when I was working on excavations with David O'Connor and also with Peter. And I remember one event in particular, I'll never forget this. We were taking a few days of R&R at Chicago House. We were staying there. And we went out into the Valley of the Kings with Herman de Velde, who was a Dutch specialist in Egyptian religion, who had worked with Lanny at Naga. And we went to the Valley of the Kings, and we spent the entire day there looking at the various scenes on the walls. And Herman de Velde was a wonderful guide, explaining all of the hieroglyphs. We came back. We were dusty and sweaty, and it was a long day. When we came back about 5 minutes before 5 o'clock, and Lanny and Martha came up to us and said, Jimmy Carter and his wife are here for tea, but you don't have time to change. So I thought, well, my mother would kill me if she knew that I was meeting the president of the United States dressed like this. But instead of, it just made me think that this was, afterwards, thinking about this, how generous Lanny was to include all of us. Here we were, sort of a grubby group of graduate students, but he made sure that we were included and that we were able to meet Jimmy Carter and his wife. And that's the kind of person that Lanny was. So I'll turn it over to Sue.
Before I introduce Sue number 2, I have a question. A number of the objects at the University of Pennsylvania Museum are there thanks to Lanny. Is that correct? Yes. Well, I want you to know we had a club trip to the Penn Museum. I wish I had known that. So for those of you who went with me to the University of Pennsylvania, it was thanks to Lanny. Okay, thank you. Sue Lezon began her career as an archaeological photographer in Carthage, and the following year in Sardis, subject of a recent archaeology committee lecture. But her focus has been primarily Egypt. In 1982, she photographed the Theban tombs of Senamut for the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and since then worked as a photographer and photographic archivist for the University of Chicago's Ethnographic Survey, about which you've heard quite a bit, to which she devotes much time since retiring as a college teacher. And she also concentrates on exhibitions of her own works. Sue?
Hi. It's so wonderful to be in a room with a lot of people who knew Lanny or knew of him peripherally, understood perhaps his scholarship if you didn't get a chance to meet him personally. But I have to tell you, if he was here tonight, he would be having the best time. And it's really fun for me to see people who have respect enough for him to come out on a cloudy night. And even someone who traveled from Egypt, Mamdou, it's lovely to have you here. I know how close you were. So I have a lot of little stories, and I'll begin. What I wanted to start with is a photograph of excavation at the Temple of Medinet Habu in the 1930s. A lot of times when you think about Egyptology expeditions, you think about excavations. But this is not what Chicago House does, unless there's a sort of salvage emergency thing that comes up. But in the early 1930s, Chicago House was founded and did this kind of work to get to the place where we could begin to demonstrate exactly how extraordinary the monuments themselves were without excavating them. Our process starts with photography, and we started with very large format cameras with black and white film, and this is the kind of camera that you see in sort of vintage magazines and movies, and where you actually put a piece of film or a glass plate at some points in the back of the camera and photograph one shot at a time, and you're underneath that classic black cloth. And this is one of the early cameras from Chicago House. And what we do is to photograph the monuments, print them in large format in black and white, and then artists take those photographs, pencil over the lines, ink over the lines, and a photographic process occurs whereby we remove all the silver from the paper, and then you have a line drawing that is, because of the skill of the artists and the Egyptologists who confer about it, is an exact facsimile of the wall itself. We never put anything into those drawings that is not on the wall at this time. So stylistically, we could fill in those gaps. We call them damage. The damage is, well, often it's quite clear what should have been there, but we don't put it in. We're showing you exactly what exists as we photograph and draw it. And so Lanny found himself here, suddenly not at an excavation for a down and dirty in the field, maybe a shower once a week kind of experience. Suddenly he was working in Egypt 6 months of the year with a team of photographers, artists, Egyptologists, conservators. He was also dealing with foreign staff, all of us from all over the world, and local staff. But he was working in Luxor Temple. This is his office, my office actually too, for a period of time, and particularly in the Colonnade Hall of King Tut. And he had a great, great interest in the Egyptological, well, I'm not a scholar, I don't even know what to call it, but Luxor Temple was one of the places of his heart. Here he is working with Ray Johnson, who was at that time the head artist at Chicago House. And they're working on a drawing that has been bleached, and they're making decisions about, should that line be there? Is that a real hieroglyph or not? Ray Johnson went on, as has already been mentioned, to become one of the many revered directors of Chicago House, and he retired quite recently. So he went from head artist, brilliant Egyptologist and art historian. Lanny worked, as I said, with all of us, foreign staff. He also was just so generous and welcoming to almost anyone. This particular photograph is one of Lanny with Labib Habashi on the left and Salah Shahat, who was the chief engineer at Chicago House, who made the physical plant run. And it did not matter who you were. Lanny accepted you and welcomed you. And you were the person he most wanted to talk to. Unless there was somebody else in the other side of the room and he wanted to talk to them. But for the moment that you were together, that was the case. Now, this particular picture was taken in 1982, I believe. This is Labib Habashi, renowned Egyptologist and friend, good friend of Lanny's and of Chicago House. And they went to this tomb. They knew of a tomb where a lot of mummies had been sort of cached away to keep them safe. And there was something very particular they were looking for. Now, I'm not an Egyptologist, remember, so I'm there to focus on what they need to have photographed. So Lanny, who never called me by my first name for unknown reasons, said, "Hey, Lezon, let's go do something cool." Okay, and I'm like this nervous 24-year-old who has this great gig, and I'm really excited. And we get to this tomb, and these coffins are like next to each other with about an inch or two between them. And he's like, "Okay, so can you get between those two? And I need a photograph of the interior." And I was terrified, as well I should have been. Now, Lanny and I didn't know each other very well, but I think I probably said something like, "Hold my hand like you mean it. Otherwise, this coffin is going to be crushed." I was like straddled these things. And we got the photographs and moved on. Of course, at the time, I didn't realize how fortunate I had been to see these coffins. This tomb was not open to the public. Again, another picture of Lanny with one of the local Egyptian staff. And that smile on both of their faces, absolutely, absolutely true. Lanny loved everyone that he worked with, most of the time. Another one of our team members, Abul Mag on the left, Lanny on the right, Abul Mag would invite us to his farm every December to cut down a branch off a large tamarisk tree. And that would be our Christmas tree. We'd take it, we'd put it on top of the Land Rover and take it back to the house and decorate it. And, and this is the kind of person Lanny was. These are Muslims. They are not celebrating Christmas, but they wanted us to join with them and them to join with us and offer us this opportunity to celebrate the way that we celebrated. And I have to say, the smile on both of their faces, again, that's what Lanny did. He made us smile. Now, at a certain point in the 1980s, the Smithsonian funds that had been keeping Chicago House alive were cut. I mean, the grant was over. And we were in sort of dire financial straits. Now, we had a lot of volunteers come out from the Oriental Institute, now known as ISAC. And one of those people was Carlotta Maher, who was standing there with Lanny, actually, in the museum at the Oriental Institute. And when volunteers came out, they very often asked me to give them work because the photo archive and the photography program was massive. And I was usually very, very happy to have some extra eyes and hands. And so Carlotta came and started to work with me. Now, Carlotta, after about a week, said, no, this is not for me, which was great because, in fact, she and Lanny began a fundraising effort that kept Chicago House going during that time. And Mamdou, you know very well. So we're going to go back there. We suddenly were supported by British Petroleum, Xerox. If Lanny and Carlotta together came to you and said, "I need an apple pie by 5 o'clock. I know you've never made one before, but if you couldn't go home and make that, we'll come by at 5 and pick it up." You'd say, "Okay." So instead what they did was go to places like Xerox and the big corporations, international corporations in Cairo, and say, "We need you to help our expedition survive." And they'd say, "Oh, okay, let me write you a check." I mean, they were an amazing fundraising team, absolutely amazing. And so we got to be better known by the United States government, ambassadors. And when Jimmy and Rosalind Carter were coming, it sounds like I knew them personally, okay? When the president and the first lady were coming to visit, it was just after he had lost the election to Ronald Reagan. And it was quite marvelous because they were a little more relaxed. It wasn't an official diplomatic visit. And they came to Chicago House, and as Sue said, you remember, they came for tea, and then Lanny took them into the library and showed them how we worked. Some of the work that I showed you pictures of earlier, the drawings. This was a particularly tricky translation from the tomb of Kerouac that Chicago House had documented years earlier. And I think you can see that President Carter is just sort of enthralled. And I don't say that lightly, because the president is taught to act. A lot of diplomats act, and well. But in fact, I was there. I took the picture. He was fascinated by the work we did. Now, that's all well and good, but in fact, I think what's even more extraordinary is to have a young teenage girl that excited with the same information. I mean, she was just in awe, and that most teenage girls I know are not quite that enthralled with pretty much anything an adult does. And that's how people responded to Lanny. Now, Lanny was also, he loved holidays, and he loved making holidays rich for those of us who weren't at home. So he was leading Christmas carols, could not sing to save his life, but we all went and sang Christmas carols with him. That's Atiya Habashi on his left. Hans Goedeke his hand is blocking him. Bill Murnane, Jen, and Don Johnson, all colleagues and friends. There were more Christmas festivities. What you see is Atiya Habashi and Dr. Henry Riyad, who was the director of the Cairo Museum for some time and came to live with us as a liaison and friend. Now, Lanny also was very active at Halloween. The thing was, we could never tell what his costume was. It was a mishmash of whatever he could find. Now, that is Lanny right there. He's got a Ghostbusters hat on. I don't really know about the rest because I think he did it at the last minute always, but he was going to participate no matter what. And just for reference, that would be me as Groucho Marx there. Here's Lanny with an extraordinary scholar, Helen Jacquet. Again, a very good friend and brilliant. And, so Lanny would talk to me about photography and then turn around and talk to Helen Jacquet about the extraordinary research that she did and the work she did. Again, that smile, the laugh you spoke about, that laugh, I will always hear that laugh in my head as well. So, computers. Somebody said, oh, look, there's a thing called a computer, and I think we need to think about that. And in fact, we got one of the earliest Macintosh computers. And he was game for that too. I mean, he was always game for new, interesting, maybe something to help us be more efficient. I just love that photo because I love the photo of the computer. And I remember what it was like when that computer arrived. Lenny was also fond of animals. He was feeding dogs, I think, at the Citadel in Cairo. I don't know who took this photograph. It was on one of the tours that he brought to Egypt. And finally, I show you this picture because I was having a really good hair day. No, because it makes me so happy to know that I saw Lanny. This was the last time I saw him. He was with a tour that he had brought to Chicago House for a reception. Maybe some of you were on that tour. And we had known each other for over probably 35 or 40 years at that point. He had been the person who hired me sight unseen based on my CV and my portfolio. He had to sit at a dinner table for 6 months with me. And he didn't know me, but he said, okay, I'll take the risk. And that's why I'm here tonight. And it was such a joy to know him. And I think that a lot of you here knew him to some degree, and perhaps better than I did. I called a colleague today, Richard Jasnow, who some of you may know, brilliant Egyptologist who teaches at Hopkins right now. And Lanny gave him his first gig as a student epigrapher in Egypt. And I asked Richard about his memories of Lanny and if he had a story. And he said, you know, what I remember is Lanny's generosity of spirit and how he invited me to come and work at Chicago House. And then Richard said, but wait, I met Lanny when I was an undergraduate in Madison, and Lanny came to give a lecture. And he said, I went up to him afterwards, and I told him I was interested in this, and he encouraged me and, you know, made me think it would be okay, and he was so nice. And he said, and Richard said, that's why I'm here. It's because Lanny gave a lecture when I was an undergraduate, and here I am. And Lanny gave me one of my very first gigs. I'd had a couple, but gave me a first really serious work as an archaeological photographer, and so encouraged me as my career progressed. So that's what I wanted to share. Thank you for your attention. And Peter, I'm handing you back to Peter.
So when Lanny retired from Chicago, he moved to Old Saybrook, Connecticut, and into this lovely house where he collected books and brought his beloved dog Bachi to stay with him. And here he is in the lovely garden with his great friend Karen Marshall, who's here with us tonight. And Lanny also did, after he retired, did a huge number of tours of Egypt and was beloved by all his tour members. And of course, Lanny had a sixth sense of picking the best people. And so he picked Mamdouh Sabai and Egyptoloid Travel, the best travel agent in Egypt, to do his tours. And so to celebrate Lanny, we, Sue and I and Sue, put together this book from the Field of Offerings, which contains, contains a history of Lanny and then articles, Egyptological articles dedicated to him. And so, and I have some flyers here if anybody wants to purchase them at a discount from the publisher, Lockwood Press. So I encourage you to buy it. And then there's also, Sue and I signed some cards, so we are not here to sign the actual volume, but you can take that along with the order form. So we'll pass them around. So, and I guess we'll have questions now if anybody has any.
I want to tell you, thank you, Yvonne. If you can help me. I have a copy of the book, and it's fabulous. So I encourage those of you who are interested to take one of these cards after the program. Do we have questions? Devon is going to go to you if you do. Would you kindly raise your hands?
There we go. Any questions? Don't be shy. Yay.
I've been thinking about Lanny's stories, and there's something I need to add to what you said, Peter. My name is Mary Faith Rhodes. I'm Martha's sister. And yeah, we did live with him before Martha married him. It was great. And got to know what an extraordinary person he was. Lanny put himself through college working in a slaughterhouse over the summers. So if any of you know him, you know there were lots of pigs in his house, and people were always giving him pigs. And I don't understand how we turned something that would have been so horrible into a memorable, I mean, his collection of pigs was considerable, especially flying pigs. They were great. Between Lanny and Martha, they encouraged, inspired, and really drove one another to excellence. And if I may just add a footnote for Martha, when Martha put off her PhD to help Lanny get his. When Lanny was hired to Chicago House, it was expected that the wife came and took care of Chicago House, took care of the kitchen, took care of making sure there was toilet paper and soap in the bathroom. I mean, and that sounds like nothing, but doing that in Luxor, Egypt at that point in time was extraordinary. Yes, it was better than the Habu Hotel, but I mean, because I helped Martha pack those suitcases with the maple syrup flavoring and things like that, and peanut butter and God knows what else she could put in, you know. And we were always fighting because I always had better suitcases than she did, so she was always borrowing my suitcases. Anyhow, it was very interesting because it was an unpaid position, so it kind of went along with the director. This was what was expected of the wife of the director. And my sister, being an extraordinary scholar in her own right, obviously she ended up eventually being in a paid position as the librarian. And so she repaired books in the library and was responsible for that, as well as just making sure everybody had cookies for tea and things like that. So anyhow, thank you.
I want to make a comment before you take the next question. We gave a gold medal to the American School of Classical Studies at Athens. Well, it was a great evening. And one of our speakers said they had done a study, and archaeologists stay married together longer than any other type of couple. And I was amazed. So this was proof. Oh, really? Athens. She was part of the American School. That's wonderful, because they do so many great work, as does ARCE, the Archaeological Institute of America. We're so fortunate as Americans to have these extraordinary organizations, and we're very lucky at the Arts Club that they also contribute, I think, to the richness of the programs which the Archaeology Committee is able to present. And to our friends from Egypt, where would we be without you? And now the question.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and thank you very much for having me here. I sincerely appreciate so much Dr. Lacovara telling me about this event, and I'm so happy that I made it to be here with you all. I've known Lanny for over 40 years. I'm his Egyptian brother, and seriously, I am. He was so sincere. He was a very dear friend of mine, and the family as well. We worked together through the years. For the past 20, 25 years, he used to come to Egypt every summer and spend his holiday or vacation with me in the north coast of Egypt, with myself, my family, my wife, and my two daughters. I have so many great memories with Dr. Bell. Being a Muslim and having a Christian in the house during the month of Ramadan in Egypt, it's rather difficult, not for me as a Muslim, but difficult for him as a Christian, because, you know, those who knows what's the tradition for the months of Ramadan, they know that we fast from sunrise to sunset. And it's a very long hours, especially in the summer. So when Lanny is in the house, he did not touch a glass of water or a piece of bread or whatever else during the entire day until the breaking the fast time, which is very long. One of the things that I really respect so much, among many other things, one day my older brother passed away. Lanny was with me in Egypt, and he was staying with me in the house. And he was invited to attend a party at the German Institute in Cairo for his honor being there. That was at 7 o'clock at night. My brother passed away in the morning, and I had everything arranged for Lanny to go to attend his party. We even went out, we bought a suit and a tie and a jacket, what have you, to look the way he should be at the party. And I went to the funeral, and I did everything possible to arrange for my brother's death. And in the evening, we always have a reception. So I sent the driver to take Lanny to go to the party. And while I'm at the mosque, receiving the condolences from people and so on and so forth, here comes Lanny. I was very surprised. I asked, what the hell? He said, Mamdouh, I cannot leave you alone in such a night. So he stood by me, taking condolences from every single person coming into the mosque for the respect. However, everyone asked, who is the gentleman? Why is he here? I mean, he's right next to Mamdouh, which was very, very special to me that Lanny was there. However, God bless his soul. He was such a great man and a great friend. And truly, I miss him so much. And thank you, Peter, for having me here.
That was a very moving.
I remember, Mary Faith, I remember once I was with Martha on the train, and we were coming from Cairo to Luxor, and somebody behind us said, this train only goes as far as Sohag. And so Martha turned to me, and she was all worried. What do we do? Because being Egyptologists, we had the best guidebook to Egypt, which was Baedeker's 1929. So we had no idea where there would be a hotel or anything. Luckily, the information, as usual, was wrong, and it did go on to Luxor. But I miss both her and Lanny. They were both so wonderful and so supportive and so generous as they were to everyone.
Christmas cookies. We had very little sugar. I mean, we could only get a small amount. And flour, it was rationed. And we were making Christmas cookies. And we had a blender, and it kind of broke a little while we were making the dough. And that breakage resulted in tiny little pieces of plastic being scattered throughout the dough. And Martha and I said, oh, this is all the dough what do we? So Martha and I spread the dough out on a table, and Martha meticulously picked out all the pieces of plastic. And we never told anyone. And you are the first ones to hear that story. And that was the kind of person that Martha was as well.
I'm coming back here then. Okay. In any case, I want to thank all of you. We've had such insight into Lanny, both as a man, as an intellect, as a personal friend. You were all absolutely splendid and provided such significance for us to understand what makes someone so extraordinary, and it really befits the great Professor Lanny David Bell. Let me conclude by saying, if you wish to be on our committee's archaeology addicts list and receive timely email reminders of our forthcoming events, kindly give your card to me. I don't see our committee archivist, Courtney Brown, this evening. September 19th is going to be reserved for club members. It's going to be a visit to the Simon Parks Conservation Studio. And we were privileged last year, thanks to Lynn Mayacole, we went to conservation of Egyptian objects at the Metropolitan. However, all of you in the audience, you are most welcome on October 28th for International Archaeology Day with His Excellency Andreas von Usko, the Deputy Permanent Representative from the Permanent Mission of Sweden to the United Nations. And the Archaeology Committee in October will also be involved with the Architecture Committee in a history of architecture lectures. So you have a lot to look forward to come October. I thank you for being here. Meet our wonderful speakers. Get the information about the book. It's terrific. And enjoy Punch and your friends in the audience. Thank you.